Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to day 98 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May, Ubiquity University and over 300 organizations from all over the world have partnered to use Zoom between 5 o'clock and 6:30 p.m. Central European Time as an open space for people all over the world to come together and share their experiences of how they're navigating through this extraordinary pandemic that has put essentially all of us into some form of lockdown, social distancing, and an acute awareness of our health and well-being. The mission of Humanity Rising is to not only allow people to simply share, but also to come together and discuss how we can increase our strategic effectiveness, how we can bring new mindsets and new narratives into the human conversation, and how we can support solutions that are emerging all around us so that we can ensure that the post-pandemic world is more sustainable and healthy and resilient and abundant and in alignment with natural systems. The world is coming to grips with the reality that this pandemic is not going away. If you've been tracking the news, Europe has had an upsurge of cases. The Far East, South America, Latin America, the United States continues to lead the world, both cases and deaths, as this little microbe, this coronavirus, is proving itself to be very intractable in the face of virtually everything that our governments and our scientists and the public are utilizing to stop its spread. It's a wake-up call. Among other things, it's put us all in the same conversation. And Humanity Rising's mission is to somehow use this extraordinary opportunity of all the world being in the same conversation to have the kind of conversation we need to have to ensure human well-being and a sustainable future. I would like to now introduce my partner and co-moderator, Sabinije van Gaffke, who will introduce our program for today.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you to all of our viewers from around the world who yet again are joining us and being catalysts for change and creating these ripples of impact that I also hope that Humanity Rising Summit and all the other platforms who are also catalysts really are contributing to. And today, like all days, we have an amazing, in this case, it's one amazing individual who will share her wealth of knowledge and wisdom. And for me, it truly is an honor to have her here because she has such relevance to convey to the world, especially of the situation that we're in. Her knowledge is more relevant than ever. And I really do hope that you will take it to heart during this session. And I want to give her an introduction for those who may not have heard or read her books previously. So we're going to have a conversation today with Riane Eisler, who is an eminent and passionate social scientist, attorney, and author whose work on cultural transformation has inspired people from all over the world. And her research has also impacted many fields, including history, economics, sociology, education, psychology, and so forth. And she's been a leader for the movement of peace and sustainability and economic equity, I would say, for a long time. And her pioneering work also in human rights has expanded the focus of international organizations to include the key components, the rights of women and children, and really bring that forth into the world. And she's president of the Center of Partnership Studies, and internationally known, I don't know if you've read it, for one of her many bestsellers, which is The Chalice and The Blade, which I would say is a book that sort of shines on two different narratives on the word of power. And I also highly recommend her latest book, which is Nurturing Our Humanity: How Domination and Partnership Shape Our Brains, Our Lives, and Our Future. And it is that transition from a culture of domination to a society and a humanity based on partnership that is the key narrative and consensus of a lot of the work that she's doing. And I know that many of our previous speakers and thought leaders have also raised this new narrative of building societies based on partnership, which really is what our humanity was initially based upon, from the indigenous people and so forth. And her book also provides evidence that caring, i.e. partnership, is a humanity default tendency that we have. And that means that we can build humane and sustainable societies by moving from this system of domination to a system of partnership. And this also needs facilitation for humanity to be able to connect what this actually means on an individual, on a collective, and on a societal level. And one thing I also like to mention, what Riane has initiated, which I'm also working on another project, is a new measurement of social wealth economic indicators, a sort of new social wealth index. We need more parameters than profit and growth to really see what is part of our society, or the GDP as we refer it to. There are so many other factors that are important into this, everything from the value of caring to human capital to the status of women and children and so forth. And I'm sure that Riane will expand on this notion even more. But I do want to say her wisdom, experience, and also common sense and value-based approach to how we can change our society, to how we can shift our mindsets, to how we can find a new narrative that we can connect to really pave the path for the future of humanity and our planet. A future that really is the proof of concept of what Einstein once said, that if we want to make change, we need to have another thought process than the thought process that actually put us into this situation. So once again, I'm so looking forward to this session and the wisdom that will be conveyed, and also to all of you who are taking part of today's session and all of our sessions. You are the ones who also are catalysts for change and making ripples of impact. So let's keep that thought and just have a 1-minute heart coherent meditation to just align ourselves with our own inner heart and the heartbeats of all of us around. So with the chant in the background, a few breaths of heart coherence. Increase your heart. Just arrive here and now. Joining in that coherence. And just remembering that through breath, we connect back to our body, minds, and souls, and connect back to our values and emotions and that sense of caring for ourselves and others. And with that, it is with pure joy that I hand over the word and the space to our alchemist and poetry, beautiful voice, Kim Rosen.
Thank you so much, Sabine. And it's such an honor to be here with Riane and Jim and you. I've been immersed in Riane's work as I seek the poems that might best prepare us to open to the wisdom that will come to us in this time. And I've chosen 3 poems with music. As you know, those of you who have been on the call, I use music. A wonderful poet once said, Kim uses music like an enzyme to deliver the poetry. So what I want you to know is that I will put the names of the poems in the chat after I speak them, and I will put the names of the music. So I invite you to simply let yourself receive whatever you receive from within you as you hear these poems in preparation and in honor of Riane's wisdom to come. The first poem is by Dina Metzger, visionary American poet. It's called Song. It's followed by a poem by Audre Lorde, Essential Voice in American Poetry, which is an excerpt from Litany for Survival. And we'll close out with a poem from Rainer Maria Rilke. There are those who are trying to set fire to the world. We are in danger. There is time only to work slowly. There is no time not to love. There are those who are trying to set fire to the world. We are in danger. There is time only to work slowly. There is no time not to love. And when the sun rises, we are afraid it might not remain. And when the sun sets, we are afraid it might not rise in the morning. And when our stomachs are full, we are afraid of indigestion. And when our stomachs are empty, we are afraid we may never eat again. And when we are loved, we are afraid love won't last. And when we are alone, we are afraid love won't ever come again. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. And when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. I have faith in all that is not yet spoken. I want to set free my innermost feelings. So what no one has dared to wish for will spring through me spontaneously. If that is arrogant, then my God, forgive me. But I need to say just this to you. My true voice should be like a sprout, a force of nature. No pushing, no holding back, the way children love you. Then with this voice, this mouth opening its delta into the open sea, this tide of moving out and returning home, I will sing you. I will announce you. I will celebrate you as no one ever has. And if that is arrogant, then let me be arrogant in this, my small prayer that stands so sincere and alone before the clouds that shroud your face. Thank you. Music by Jamie Sieber. Poems by Dina Metzger, Audre Lorde, and Rainer Maria Rilke. And I'll put the names in the chat.
Thank you, Kim. Welcome, everyone. And in particular, I want to welcome all of our live streaming partners this week. We're going out through 11 days of global unity. So we're going out to at least 15, 20,000, maybe more people every day. We're deeply grateful for the 40 plus live streaming partners that are broadcasting day by day these sessions of Humanity Rising. And so I just want to welcome everybody hither and yon to this dialogue today with Riane Eisler. So Riane, why don't we just jump right in? And what I would like to start with is just your experience and interpretation of this pandemic. How are you doing? How are you viewing it? What would be your commentary on this extraordinary experience that humanity is undergoing at this time?
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank everybody, Sabinije, and of course the poet. It is a pleasure for me to be with you this morning. The pandemic. Well, my husband and I have been in complete isolation, which has been interesting. Of course, I've continued to do a lot of video work, but that's not really new for me because I've been doing that. We at the Center for Partnership Studies have webinars, we have online courses, but I see the pandemic for all of us, not only for me, as an opportunity to really reflect on the old normal, which even before this pandemic was totally unacceptable. I mean, if a quarter of all children in this wealthy United States live in poverty, that is not a, quote, normal that we want to return to, not to speak of the fact that even before the pandemic, we were literally destroying our natural life support systems. So I look at it as a time to not only reflect on what we have, what we had, but also to work on creating a new, better normal, which, as you know, has been my life's work. Well, I mean, it's been the basis of my research, my writing, my speaking, keynoting, activism, everything.
Do you, Riane, do you see the pandemic in apocalyptic terms as a kind of a world-shattering experience like 9/11? Do you see that in the end it'll probably be no more than a speed bump? How would you, given your deep learning and wide perspective, how would you view the pandemic and kind of the overall historical scheme of things? Are we making too much of it? Are we taking it as seriously as it needs to be taken? What's your view in that?
Well, how we look back on it depends on what we do with it, doesn't it? It depends on human agency. I think some people are in denial, you know, and that is a response that, in terms of the conceptual framework introduced in my work of the partnership domination social scale, is very characteristic of people who have been brought up in a domination culture or subculture, you know, is mediated by families in particular. Other people are just sort of managing to get through it without thinking much about it. But there are those of us who, as I said, see it as an opportunity to really think differently. And again, thinking differently, I mean, as Einstein said, and as Sabine mentioned, we cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. And one of my contributions in that are new language and a new conceptual framework, because the old language, well, we know from linguistic psychologists that the categories provided by a language really channel our thinking, so that it's very difficult, for some people impossible, to think of other alternatives. So for starters, we need new language. But beyond that, we really need to understand that it's not coincidental that the categories that we are provided, for example, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist, that they really marginalize or ignore the majority of humanity, women and children, because there's a reason not to look at those connections that helps maintain what I call domination systems.
Yeah, I think that's right. We need, in saying we need a new language, you know, we really need a new story, a new narrative, in addition to a new language to kind of catalyze a new state of consciousness. And I know that that's been one of the most consistent themes throughout the last 98 days of Humanity Rising. People starting to stretch their imaginal frameworks to try to use the occasion of the pandemic to recreate language and to bring into consciousness a whole new narrative. You know, and when I had a dialogue with Jean Houston, for example, and I asked her, you know, where would her narrative start? She said, it's got to start with Gaia. it's got to start with the earth. It's got to start with the realization that we are children of the earth, and biomimicry needs to be our new Torah. What would be your comment on that as kind of an origin, the foundation of the new story? Where would you place it?
Well, I love Jean, and I think that she has this wonderful mythopoetic capacity, as you mentioned. And I don't think that, of course, our narrative starts long, long ago, precisely with that recognition that we are all part of a living earth, Gaia. And as those of you who are familiar with the Chalice and the Blade, which was the first book to report on my research, for millennia, we humans really recognized that connection with our so-called Mother Earth. I mean, there's a reason we call it Mother Earth. But we lost that to a very large extent with the shift to a domination system, where an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-kind, I mean, with all of the very punitive in many cases, or very capricious in others, deity controlled us. So I think that I saw in the chat box, somebody said, what is this new story? Give us some examples. So I'd like to do that, if I may, because my newest book, Nurturing Our Humanity, which, by the way, came out last year with Oxford University Press, really debunks the old story by presenting the evidence that we now have. I mean, enormous sound evidence that actually one story that we've told, which is a story that maintains what I call domination systems, that we're bad, whether it's original sin or whether it's selfish genes, which justifies, of course, if we're bad, we have to be controlled right from the top. That story is completely false. That actually we humans have an enormous capacity for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, just as we also have capacities for insensitivity, cruelty, violence. But that which of these capacities are expressed depends not on some inevitable deterministic gene or deity or original sin or what have you, but on the kinds of cultures that we create. So the beginning of a new story for me starts really at our birth. And that is that we come into this planet equipped with an enormous capacity for empathy. As the biologist Frans de Waal wrote, if empathy were not something that is really inherent in, quote, human nature, nature would never have gone into the empathy business. I mean, and yet we see empathy again and again, but it is either suppressed or compartmentalized in domination systems. So one story that I think we really have to leave behind is that, too bad, like the caveman cartoon, right? In one hand, he's got this club, weapon, cruelty, violence. In the other, he's dragging a woman by the hair. That, too bad, violence, injustice, male dominance. That's just how it's always been. And by implication, that's how it always has to be. That is a lie. Because for millennia, and this is where another piece of huge body of evidence comes in, for millennia, we lived in societies that were more equitable, more gender balanced, and less violent, with warfare at best being 5 to 10,000 years old. And the evidence is very solid on that, but it's very hard to dislodge these old beliefs. So it's up to us, to every one of you, to start spreading this new story about, quote, human nature, and yes, about human society and human possibilities. And I'll stop here and give you a chance because I just,
Well, this is it's very interesting. Let me go back to Chalice and the Blade and ask you for your interpretive framework for that transitional period between awareness of the Mother Earth and egalitarian systems and the rise of patriarchy. I mean, it's been observed many that patriarchy, civilization, agriculture, the axial religions, all more or less rose together, so that there was a sort of a shift of state as humanity moved into cities, huge urban areas, writing, monumental architecture. Talk to us about um, what happened that patriarchy took such a solid grip on virtually all of humanity as it moved into what we call civilization.
okay, but I'd like to backtrack for a minute because, as you
Sure.
know, Jim, I don't use the term patriarchy. And I don't use it uh, not because we don't have male dominance as part of our domination heritage, but because, first of all, it's an inaccurate term. It's very interesting. If you think of the categories provided by our language, the old language that we inherited from domination systems, it really, when it comes to a society uh, focusing on gender relations, the only alternatives that it gives us are either matriarchy or patriarchy, which, if you think about it, are semantically two sides of a domination coin, aren't they? Either fathers dominate or mothers dominate. There is no partnership alternative, okay? And that is characteristic of domination systems. As President Trump said, it's all about domination, right? Uh, the, you either dominate or you are dominated. That is not true. My research and the research of so many others, including neuroscientists, show that not only is there what I call a partnership alternative, and it does not, by the way, just mean working together. And I'll get back to that because people, you know, cartels, gangs, terrorists, they all work together in domination systems, don't they? More complicated than that. But the question that you ask me is how did we have this shift from a more partnership-oriented way of life to a more domination one? Well, one thing I want to clarify is that all the basic, because you know there are a lot of conflicting stories. Okay, I mean one is so uh, when we lived in caves, you know, we lived more equitably, but with quote civilization, right? You know, we shifted. And that really actually is not true. In the Chalice and the Blade, for example, I write about the Minoan civilization that flourished on the island of Crete for millennia, um, which was already a quote high civilization. What do I mean by that? It had the first paved roads in Europe. It had this what you call monumental. I mean, if you look at the ruins um, of Minoan civilization, you see where the Greeks got a lot of their architecture, for example. You know, the columns I mean, it's all there. Um, and not only that, it was already a centralized civilization. Um, so we that story really isn't true, and neither is there are many theories, all right, to just get straight to your question as to what happened. One theory, as you said, is that the rise of agriculture, more complexity, inevitably brought this on. And that, as I said, is not a true story. It was not inevitable. Another story, another theory, because theories are stories, um, is the one that actually, at least in Europe, is beginning to get some support from nothing less than DNA studies. And that is the theory proposed by the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas of Indo-European invasions, wave after wave of so-called Kurgan invasions. And indeed, we find the old DNA completely, almost completely replaced at about the same time period, about 35 to 3000 before the current era that she writes about. So there's a lot of ferment right now and a lot of discussion in even the academy, but the old stories stick. And but what I want to say is I am neither a technological determinist nor an environmental determinist. What happened, happened. And we can and have to reverse that shift. For me, that is the most important part of what needs to be done right now. And I can talk more about that.
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to complete the answer. Oh, and
Yeah,
there's
I mean,
another theory, which is really bizarre, by the way, which is that that the shift happened when men discovered that they have a role in paternity. And of course, that is so stupid. I mean, I have to say, but it is propagated. Um, because if you look at, for example, in Çatalhöyük, there's a fresco of a woman and a man in embrace, and then next to them, the woman with a baby, with a child. And it's like a lesson in sex education, isn't it? I mean, of course, these people, they knew. I mean, they observed other species, for goodness sakes. And so what happens? Uh, but see, to say that men are bad, or stupid, that they didn't realize this for such a long time, it's part of this in-group versus out-group thinking, which goes both ways, by the way, in domination systems.
yes, well, I appreciate that. And the reason why I was asking about kind of the origins of patriarchy is because, as you, as well as many others point out, we're sort of at the end of that arc. There's been something that's been happening in the world consciousness, I would say, over the last 75 years, maybe say since the Second World War, where you have this explosion of cultural change from, the liberation of women to the extraordinary foment in the realm of gender and sexuality, gays and lesbians and pan and trans and NGOs all over the world, so that we're clearly in an era. As they say, we're not in an era of change, we're in a change of eras. And but I wanted to kind of look back to that origin of the dominator model, as you put it, to see what kind of systemic forces were at play. And I'd love to hear you then to kind of interpret what's happening now, kind of at the deep recesses of our collective consciousness, that is enabling almost like a geyser of eros and foment, and change mostly around the liberation of women, the egalitarian impulses around gender and sexuality, the emergence of partnership. I mean, it's like something is happening independent of individual human will that is reshaping culture at a fundamentally critical moment. How do you understand it? What are the triggering mechanisms? What's gone into this massive transposition of value?
Well, um, to put it in a nutshell, the story of our cultural evolution is one of states of equilibrium or semi-equilibrium, and then periods of great dislocation. Now, the period of great dislocation, and it was a period of enormous dislocation, uh, and it lasted for several thousand years. It wasn't just like that, okay? Uh, and it happened in different places at different times. And it didn't happen everywhere. I mean, there are still isolated cultures like the Muso of China that hung on. When the Chalice and the Blade was published, a group of scholars at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing got together and wrote their own book called The Chalice and the Blade in Chinese Culture. And they found, and one of the chapters is about the Musu, by the way, but they found that there too, there was this shift. And we see it, uh, I mean, we have physical evidence because whether it was in Europe or whether it was in China, there was a profusion of female or androgynous sculptures before. And in fact, European museums, the basements are full of these figures, but they call them women instead of understanding that they were an abstract form of art. You know, like the idea that the so-called Venuses of the old Stone Age, which is kind of ridiculous, were a form of erotica, pornography, even. It is so crazy because, I mean, here we have these, they have no faces, they have these large fecund bodies, and their vulvas are very clearly etched. So you tell me whether these really could conceivably be erotica. Of course not. They were, art is a form of symbolic language, okay? But let me get back to disequilibrium. We know today from system science, from nonlinear dynamics, from chaos theory, and these do play a role in the conceptual framework of history that I've proposed, that there was a period of great disequilibrium during which, for whatever theory is right, or maybe there are several ways that it happened, there was this massive shift. And it came about largely through violence. Now, there's no question about that. I mean, whether Gimbutas is correct, that was the impetus, these waves and waves of pastoralists herding people who came in and pretty much wiped out the original, more partnership-oriented population in Europe, who knows? But what we're seeing today is another major period of disequilibrium. And Jim, we started to see the movement towards partnership actually in the West, which is where is very visible with the Enlightenment. Because look, let's put a different spin, a different story here about modern history, the last 300 years, which took place during the technological shift and the dislocations from it, of the shift first from an agrarian to an industrial society, which also didn't happen overnight, by the way, happened gradually, and now accelerated with the shift from an industrial to a knowledge service post-industrial society. So we have periods of disequilibrium, which are very difficult, but they also give us the opportunity to change thinking. and to create a more partnership-oriented society. So if you look at modern history through the lens of the domination, partnership, social scale, you see that every progressive social movement, starting with the Enlightenment in Europe about 300 years ago, has challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. Whether it was the Enlightenment so-called rights of man movement, challenging the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their quote subjects, or the feminist and then the women's liberation and the women's rights movement, challenging another so-called, another tradition of domination, the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule over the women and children in the quote castles of their homes, whether it was the abolitionists and then the civil rights and now the Black Lives Matter movement, challenging another supposedly divinely ordained tradition of domination of a quote superior race to rule over inferior ones, whether it was the movements for social and economic justice, challenging top-down control, right? Be it economic or not, because it's not really capitalism. Capitalism is markets, but it's domination economics that's being challenged, isn't it? And that goes back to Chinese emperors and Arab pasha, sheiks and Indian pashas. I mean, let's think of our history here a little bit. But whether it was the movement, the peace movement, or the movement now, which is a very important movement, challenging the pandemic of abuse and violence against the majority of humanity, women and children, or whether it's the environmental movement challenging our once hallowed conquest of nature, right? That at our level of technology is slowly doing us in, at our level of population and technology, they all challenge the same thing. But, and this is really vital, and I want, if you take nothing else with you from this, most of the energy, most of the resources of these movements have gone into dismantling what I call the top of the domination pyramid, which is what? It's politics and economics as conventionally defined. Much less energy has gone into dismantling the foundations, starting with childhood, with gender, with economics, but from a very different perspective, and story and language, the four cornerstones I've introduced that we must shift. And so what has happened is in places where, for example, the so-called traditional family, right? Which it wasn't traditional, but that's what we call it, which is a code for what is a code for really? An authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. Whether it was Hitler's Germany, whether it's Khomeini's Iran, the Taliban, ISIS, that's always a top priority, isn't it?
Mm.
There's a reason for it. This is foundational, and we must change that. And until we change these four cornerstones, starting with childhood and gender, we're going to see regressions. Now, as you said, the good news is that talk about gender. Look, I was a pioneer. I wrote the first article for the Human Rights Quarterly in 1987. Believe it or not, that was the first article on what we today call women's rights as human rights. That's how recent this consciousness really is in the academy.
Extraordinary.
Isn't it extraordinary?
Yeah.
It's not just extraordinary, it's very sad, because if you think about Western science, and of course, and we don't have genital mutilation. We don't have child slavery. I mean, yes, we have domination traditions, but they're much stronger in other world regions, okay? But if you really think about Western science, as the historian of science David Noble said in his book, A World Without Women, it originated where? About 600 and so years ago in a celibate, monastic, all male culture, a world without women. And I would also add a world without children.
Yes.
And it was only 50 years ago, that we even started to have women's studies in universities, and then men's studies and gender studies and queer studies. And they're still marginalized off to one side. This is something we've inherited, and it makes absolutely no sense, does it, to marginalize or ignore the majority of humanity, women and children. But that's what we've inherited. So we can't see the connection between the status of children and women and whether a society is more equitable and more peaceful or warlike. I mean, but it's there if we look at the whole picture.
Now, Riane, there's been a couple of comments in the chat. What are your 4 cornerstones again?
Well, I've written extensively about them, and the last, in Nurturing Our Humanity, certainly, they are first of all childhood.
Uh-huh.
Why? Because we know from neuroscience that we are not born with fully formed brains. I mean, we've known this for a long time, and that this whole argument about nature versus nurture is nonsense. It's a distraction.
Exactly.
Because what really happens is that our brains develop, especially in our first years, in interaction with our environments. We have very flexible brains, and I can return to that. So it's not coincidental that all of these domination regimes, whether they're Eastern or Western, Northern or Southern, rightist or leftist, capitalist or socialist, by the way, all cling to this so-called traditional family. You know, the authoritarian, rigidly male-dominated, highly punitive family. You know, you've got to obey or else. And gender is the second one. And why is gender so important? Well, I'll give you 2 reasons. One is, again, whether it is racism in the United States or Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia in the Middle East, it's in-group versus out-group thinking and action. But what is the model for humanity that children internalize in domination subcultures and cultures? It is that difference, beginning with the difference in form between the male form and the female form in our species, is to be equated with superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving. And that's a template, isn't it? So it's not coincidental that these societies, you know, whether it was Hitler in Germany or, as I said, Khomeini in Iran, or the Taliban or ISIS or the so-called rightist fundamentalists. See, it's not really religious fundamentalism, it's domination fundamentalism that we're dealing with in religion, okay? I mean, it's the configuration of the domination system. We have to understand, but there's another reason, and this takes us to economics, which is the third cornerstone, but economics from a different perspective. Let's stop arguing about capitalism versus socialism, because while both were attempts to lessen the suffering caused by domination economics, they both perpetuated domination elements. I mean, let's just be very clear that for both Smith and Marx, there was not a word about caring for our natural life support systems. Nature was there to be exploited. And as for the work of caring for people, starting in childhood, for them, that was just, quote, women's work in their time to be performed for free in a male-controlled household. So male-controlled that as late as when Marx wrote, in many places, even in the United States and in Europe, if a woman was injured negligently, she could not sue. Only her husband could for loss of her services. I mean, it couldn't be clearer, but we are not taught our history. And of course, story and language follow. And we will go back to that again and again. But they are all interconnected, and we can change these, but it isn't going to happen overnight. But there's movement in that direction, isn't there? But there's also movement pulling us back. And that's the struggle for our future, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in light of what you just said, let's pause there, because isn't that the world dilemma? What you're talking about in terms of a change of culture takes time. But scientists are telling us we've run out of time.
Yes.
That with the irretrievable loss of the glaciers now in Greenland, I've just read yesterday that the big ice flow that's connecting two huge glaciers in Antarctica is about ready to break up, and that the combination of Greenland and Antarctica, the sea level rises are going to be exponential, that we've got about 10 years to sort this thing out, or we lose, Riane, civilization, certainly as we've known it, if not the species Homo sapiens. So in light of the fact that what you've been talking about takes time, in a world where we're running out of time, what is your prescription as to what we should now do? How do we implement partnership models that are generational in a short time frame?
Well, look,
or can we?
I mean, I'm very, very well aware of what's happening, which is really at our level of technology, the domination system reaches its logical end, right? Which could be our logical end as a species. So, but we have to think of it in both short-term and long-term actions. Short-term, absolutely, we have to do something about the fact that it is human activities, carbon emissions, very centrally, that we have to really do something about. And that can be done through legislation and through the will. But at the same time that we do that, at the same time that there is now agitation, for example, for police reform, as there is agitation for laws and policies that support, one lesson from the COVID-19 pandemic is that the essential workers are those that care. Whether it's healthcare workers, childcare workers, people who care about providing us with food. So we can enact policies that, paid parental leave, which is already happening in much of Northern Europe, by the way. Okay, and especially Sweden, Finland, Norway, which pioneered caring policies, which, by the way, is the major reason that as they moved towards, I mean, it didn't happen by itself. It happened as they moved towards a partnership kind of society, that they are very economically successful, and they are not socialist. I mean, the whole perversion of what socialism means in popular language is insane. I mean, they have a very healthy market economy. Where do we get this notion? But so we have the short-term things that we must do. But as we have seen, I mean, look, we don't have slavery as legal anymore. We don't have 12-hour days as legal anymore. We don't have the complete disenfranchisement of really women anymore. I mean, we have had movement towards partnership, right? But it has been punctuated by regressions because we haven't paid enough attention to the longer term work, which is the work of culture change. Now, I think though, with our contemporary, really, technologies of communication, we can somewhat shorten that time period. And for me, the revolution in consciousness is really what happened to me, waking out of the domination trance. I mean, to suddenly realize that so much of what I had been taught, just about everything I had been taught in all my years of so-called higher education, had almost nothing by, about, or for people like me, women. I mean, that was a huge awakening, and it's beginning to change, but very marginalized.
Just to take a discursus, what happened? How old were you? What were your circumstances? What happened when you had that epiphany?
Well, it was in the 60s.
Oh,
And it was during a period, again, of disequilibrium, of dislocation, when we were questioning. And we are in such a period today.
huh.
But in the 60s, we mistook rebellion for reconstruction. And how can you reconstruct if you just keep talking about being nicer and being more peaceful and this and that without paying attention to the majority of humanity and without paying attention to what I call the gendered system of values, which devalues anything stereotypically in domination systems considered soft or feminine, whether in women or men. You know, men are called sissies, wimps, or in social and economic policy. So there's always money, right, for prisons, you know, the stereotype of the punitive male head of household, right? I'm going to punish you. There's always money for weapons and wars, you know, the epic hero, right, of domination systems, the hero is killer. But somehow we don't seem to find money for caring for people, for childcare, for health care, for the soft, for the feminine. Let's understand that this has nothing to do with women or men, okay? But that we have inherited this system of gendered values. And to change it, we have to first unpack it and then leave it behind.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's an extraordinary thing if you think back, because you know, I went through the '60s as well, and that was such an extraordinary moment of awakening for a whole generation. I, you know, remember, you know, the resistance against the Vietnam War, and it was only later I heard a lecture from a professor at Harvard who remarked that the Vietnam War was the first time in human history where the young men en masse refused to fight.
That's true.
And we didn't stop the war, but there was just this awakening, Riane, that seemed to come from almost the outside in as much as the inside out. And people like you and Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and, you know, all these incredible women in some magical way kind of woke up, and a whole generation woke up, and we changed culture dramatically. But we didn't change politics. And if you look back at the 60s with the assassination of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, that all happened during this cultural foment. And now the United States has ended up with Trump. And you've got Orban in Hungary, and you've got Xi in China, and Modi in India, and Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Putin in Russia. So it's as if politics has been immune from the
But it
cultural
isn't
transformation.
politics. It isn't politics that's been immune. It has been certain segments of the population. I mean,
I'll
in
say more about that because I wanted you to
nurturing
unpack that. Why
humanity.
the recalcitrance of political change?
Yeah, because political change follows from the four cornerstones. That is exactly what it follows from.
Good point.
And if we don't pay attention to those, then of course we'll continue to have regressions. I mean, because look, in Nurturing Our Humanity, my co-author, by the way, who I had been working for about 7 years on Nurturing Our Humanity when I invited the anthropologist Douglas Fry to join me, because he is probably, by the way, and this is an aside, the world's leading expert on foraging societies, which is how we lived for millions of years. And he calls them the original partnership societies. They were more egalitarian, gender balanced, peaceful. Uh, that's the configuration of the partnership model. Now, the movement towards partnerism until now has happened in bits and pieces. And unfortunately, we are still stuck in right versus left, socialism versus communism, or capitalism, or whatever, uh, religious versus secular. You know, a colleague of mine calls these weapons of mass distraction because they fragment our consciousness. I mean, when I started my research, I immediately could see that I would get nowhere using these categories because there have been repressive, regressive, violent societies in every one of them. So if we want a roadmap to a more equitable, peaceful, caring society, none of them offer it, for goodness sakes. And yet we're stuck. Well, once we unstick and we have this larger conceptual framework of the movement towards partnerism, then we can move more quickly. Because, and once we recognize the four cornerstones, because you wouldn't build a house, would you, without have it making sure that it has solid foundations. So this is fundamental.
Yeah, that's a very good point, you know, and in that regard, I'd love your comment on donut economics and the fact in one of our sessions about 6 weeks ago, we had Kate Rayworth, who's the author of Donut Economics, and she was speaking very powerfully, Riane, in ways strikingly similar to you, that rather than get into capitalism, neoliberalism, communism, socialism, she's tried to reinvent the language of economics by using the image of a donut. And at the center of the donut, the inner ring of the donut, is what she calls human well-being. And the outer ring of the donut is ecological systems and constraints, so that the purpose of the human enterprise is to enable human beings to thrive, whether they're children, whether they're women, whether they're men, whether they're foreigners that are in the country for a short-term stay or a long-term stay. And you know, as you know, Amsterdam and Copenhagen and cities now all over the world are embracing donut economics. We've got some countries like New Zealand that are starting to put human well-being now at the center. So, you know, what you're talking about, I love it that you're coming up with new language. And it's a very important observation that the dominator impulse is just as alive in socialism as capitalism in the East as in the West. And we need to move to a new way of being that's not any longer thought of in the ideologies that came out of the dominator model. And so I just wonder, what's your comment on donut economics and regenerative economics? Is that what you mean by economics as your third cornerstone? What does partnership mean in economics in your model?
Well, it certainly has the donut economics of human well-being and the limits, obviously, of, you know, when I spoke at I mean, that's part of it, but it's only part of it, because I think that the kind of economic system that we have depends very much on the guiding values. And so I believe that the fact that we have devalued caring for people, as well as keeping a clean and healthy home environment, by the way, that is related. You know, that quote, women's work, right, is related to not caring for our planetary environment. I mean, the fact that there is nothing in either socialist or capitalist theory about caring for people starting at birth or caring for nature being fundamental to economics, that is a huge problem. And
Yep.
it is not addressed by donut economics, except very peripherally. So the new metrics that we have developed at the Center for Partnership Studies, inspired by my book, by the way, The Real Wealth of Nations, which is now being translated and published in German under a new title of The Ignored Fundamentals of Economics, which is exactly what it's about. Really, the social wealth economic indicators, which we launched with a grant from the Kellogg Foundation in 2014, are now being really updated and condensed into a social wealth index, because we have 24 of those indicators, and that's a lot of indicators. But what is different about them is, number one, they take into account what we know from neuroscience about the importance, and they are aligned to our post-industrial knowledge service economy in their focus on human capacity development. Okay, and by that I don't just mean the capacity to be a better cog in the economic machine, but consciousness, caring, creativity. Those are all essential human traits that we need to further, but also investment in caring for people starting in childhood, and investment in caring for nature. So there are really two sets of indicators which really take into account the neuroscience, that whether or not we have that, quote, high quality human capital, right, these resilient, flexible people who can work in teams, who can adapt to change, which we're seeing is very rapid right now, largely hinges on the quality of care and education children receive in their early years. I mean, most people don't know that 85% of our brain structure is developed in the ages of 1 to 5.
Yeah.
I mean, that has to be part of policy. And so while I absolutely agree with regenerative economics, as I said when I spoke to the United Nations General Assembly in a session called Harmony with Nature, you're not going to have harmony with nature unless you change the value system. And that requires looking at the gendered system of values I just mentioned. Caring is a human trait. It is not just a female trait. And
Yes.
men and women are both deprived of their full humanity by these rigid gender stereotypes of domination systems. But you have to have rigid gender stereotypes if you're going to rank one over the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the movement towards more fluidity, gender fluidity, is very important. I mean, there's so many trends, but if we can't put them together, that's the really importance of this work, because it not only gives you new language, but if you immerse yourself in it, you have a whole new worldview, that things that, like what I just said earlier about, we think of the progressive social movements as random, right? But they all challenge the same thing, a tradition of domination. You know, everything falls into place then, if you
Yes.
have that. And that is very empowering, as many people will tell you who because that's the mail that I get. Those are the comments that I get from people who read my books.
Well, we're drawing to the end of our time, Riane, but let me ask you one more question, just to tease out what you mean by partnership, because I think that's absolutely right. I went through a thought experiment in the middle of the pandemic. It was April, and things were going from bad to worse, and we were kind of just keying in that this was happening, and that this pandemic was really reshaping the world. So I thought, if I was dictator for a day and I could make one decision, what decision would I make that would be as transformational of the world as the pandemic had just? I mean, it shut our world down. I mean, we saw during the pandemic that the human race can turn on a dime because we almost in unison shut ourselves down, went into isolation and into lockdown. So I thought, what would be of a commensurate magnitude? The first thought was, well, why don't we just stop it? No more oil drilling. And then I thought, well, that's going to stop a crisis, but it's not going to change anything. It's going to leave everything in place. And I thought, how about stopping the deforestation of the Amazon? That's not going to really change anything. And I thought and thought, then I thought, if I was dictator for a day, I could make one decision. I would decree that in the next 30 days, in every government and organization on planet Earth, executive leadership would be turned over to women until 2030.
Well,
now, in light of what you mean by partnership, was I misinformed? Is that a good idea, but an inadequate idea? I mean, as you look into the future with the rise of women, which in my view is becoming, I would say, a national security issue, not just a culturally correct thing to do, for all the reasons I think everybody watching this program knows. But if you had to make one decision and you were dictator for a day and you could have a world transformational effect, what would you offer into the world?
I think you are very much on the right track in a way, but that is a necessary but not sufficient.
Very good. Yep, I agree.
Okay.
I agree. It would be a good start. It would be a good start.
It would be a very good start because, let me say, for example, if you look at nations like Finland, Sweden, Norway, that at the beginning of the 20th century were so poor there were famines, and today are regularly in the highest ranks of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports, in the highest ranks of the world happiness reports. They got there by moving towards the partnership side, and a very important part of that was indeed that half of their, about 40 to 50% of their national legislatures are female. But there's a systems dynamic we have to understand, because while certainly not all women are caring by any means, as the status of women rises, men no longer find it such a threat to their, quote, masculinity, their status, to embrace more soft feminine values. So both women and men voted for caring policies. So what I would go to is a double thing. Certainly make sure that half of all governing bodies are female. But I would also enact a guiding principle for all social and economic policies, that they be guided by what will work for, really in light of what we today know, modern knowledge, is going to be good for human development and for a healthy planet. And that is caring for people, starting at birth and caring for nature. If those principles, which are, quote, soft, feminine, caring, you know, putting caring and economics in the same sentence, wow, right? If those principles were enacted, then we would not have this crisis, because obviously then we couldn't be destroying the forests, which are the lungs of our planets. We could not be continuing to
Right.
drill for oil. I mean, you see what I'm saying? So you have to sort of go back to both the structure, which is what you were talking about, leadership, but leadership in both the family and the state or tribe that can be equal. Because remember, men, once liberated from this old gender stereotype that being a real man means not being like a woman, in other words, not being soft or feminine, men can be very caring too. But see, I want to say something, but it is such a mess because domination families cause deflection of fear and rage to in-group versus out-group thinking. As I said, whether it's Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia or racism or anti-Semitism, it doesn't really matter because you cannot say, my parents are causing me this pain. My father is causing me this pain. My mother is causing me this pain. So we're talking really about going deeper and wider and
Yeah.
thinking differently in a way that includes the majority of humanity, women and children.
Mhm. Mhm. Beautiful. Beautifully put. And that's a perfect spot to thank you and end our dialogue for today. But Riane, every time we interact, it deepens my respect for your extraordinary intellect and insight into the human condition. And by the way, everyone, um, we're preparing a special week, the week of the US elections on the 3rd of November. And we're going to have Riane back and some really, really interesting people to comment on what will be a very eventful milestone in US history and world affairs, depending on what happens. Well,
Yes,
Riane, thank you so much. We're indebted to you for your lifetime as a public intellectual and guide for humanity during these critical times. So thank you.
thank
Thank
you, Jim. It's always a pleasure.
you. And now, Kim will give you the final word with just a few minutes of poetry, just to bring us back into the timeless.
What a privilege to be in the presence of the two of you. The insight and clarity has infused me, and I'm so grateful to both of you. I feel that I'm in the presence of world treasures and very precious moment. I want to bring in the voice of Joy Harjo, who is our nation's poet laureate. She's the first Native American poet laureate in the United States. And Joy is a member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and I am deeply grateful that I can speak her words as a outflow of what I have taken in from both of you. She has just been the editor of the anthology of Native Nations poetry, which I hear is fantastic. I can't wait to get it. It's called When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through. Just to take in that title at this moment. When the light of the world was subdued, our songs came through. The poem is called Fire by Joy Harjo. A woman can't survive by her breath alone. She must know the voice of mountains. She must recognize the foreverness of blue sky. She must flow with the elusive bodies of night wind women who will take her into herself. Look at me. I am not a separate woman. I am a continuance of blue sky. I am the throat of the Sandia Mountains, a night wind woman who burns with every breath she takes. A woman can't survive by her breath alone. She must know the voices of mountains. She must recognize the foreverness of blue sky. She must flow with the elusive bodies of night wind women who will take her into her own self. Look at me. Look at me. I am not a separate woman. I am a continuance of blue sky. I am the throat of the Sandia Mountains, a night wind woman who burns with every breath she takes. Thank you, Joy Harjo. Thank you, Jamie Sieber, for the music. Thank you, Jim and Riane and Sabinije, for the bounty today.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you all. This has been a very rich session. Thank you, Riane. On Monday, we're going to have a very special treat. Monday is the 21st of September. It's the International Day of Peace, the 11 days of global unity that has been developed by dozens, if not hundreds of partners all over the world. Began on the 11th of September. It concludes on September 21. We're doing a very special program with City Transformers that has aggregated youth in, I think, 90 cities all over the world to make a special presentation from the youth to the leaders of the world through UNDP. And a number of the youth will be appearing on our program that will be moderated by our own Matt Robertson and Raji Jayasinghe, who are next gen staff at Ubiquity. We take very seriously Riane for cornerstones to honor the young people that are emerging into their majority at this time. They're inheriting the whirlwind. They need to come together to solve human challenges. And so however we can support them, Humanity Rising is 100% there. Also on Monday, we have the inaugural session of Humanity Rising Netherlands. You may remember back on the 7th of September, Jolanda Eigenstein and a group of Dutch people who have been really enthusiastic about Humanity Rising. They're now starting Humanity Rising Netherlands 5 days a week. And their sessions will be, we're going to try to broadcast that live on our Facebook page. So those of you in the Netherlands, they're going to be in Dutch, as far as I know. That's the first of probably a dozen groups now around the world that are starting Humanity Rising local sessions at a different time than 5 o'clock p.m. Central European time. but it's just a measure of how Humanity Rising is growing as we convene day by day. Sessions like with Riane, where you can just spend a few minutes luxuriating in deep conversations about the human future. What now should be done? How now should we think? What now should we do under current world circumstances of a pandemic within a framework in which scientists worldwide are telling us we're running out of time? So when someone like Riane talks about moving from the dominator model to the partnership model, this is not an academic, interesting question. It's a matter of global, central, human urgency. And as she said, we have to parse those aspects of the transition that are going to take some time. Because human culture has been evolving for millennia. And sometimes it changes catastrophically in a revolutionary foment. We just saw it happen during the pandemic. And sometimes it takes a while. So as Riane said, and with this, I want to close, that we need to really consider deeply, my friends, what do we need to do now? What can wait that we need to engender transgenerationally? Because some of this is going to take time. If you look back over the last 75 years and the beginnings of the women's movement, they're still struggling. So are the gays. Look at the Black people, the young Black men, and the struggle in this country over 400 years for the obvious. And it's still denied on TV, as it was with George Floyd, and dozens since then. So Humanity Rising is about convening conversations that really matter and transforming them in all of our lives, individually and collectively, into actions that can really make a difference at a moment in which there's no more neutral ground. All of us now are in the play. All of our decisions count. Every single one of them, every day. So I want to thank you once again, Riane. I want to thank you, Kim. Your poetry is absolutely sublime. Thank you all for joining. We'll see you again on Monday, 5 o'clock to 6:30 Central European Time for our next Zoom session of Humanity Rising on the International Day of Peace. Thank you, everyone. Have a good weekend. Bye, Riane.
Bye-bye. And thank you. And bless you.
Thank you.